Today I want to talk about getting customers to switch. It's a question I'm getting more and more. Like, Victor, how do we, if we're going after a certain business, how do we displace an incumbent? In other words, how do we get the other person or other company out so we can then sell them? So this is a three-part series because this is not an easy thing to do. And so what I want to do is I broke it up into three parts, and over the next 3 weeks, today being the first week, let's walk through the three things you'll need to know to kind of displace or at least oust a competitor. So let's jump into the content. There's the title: Getting Customers to Switch, Overcoming the Perceived Effort Effect. Now, let's get into some math real quick, some physics, if you will. Now, most of you know my background is electrical engineering. Yes, I have an engineering degree. But anyway, so in one of my courses, calculus and physics also, one of the things we always had to deal with is this whole thing about, imagine this is a block, like just a block. And then you have a surface, right? This is the surface down here. That's the surface. Now, there's two different forces, and I'm being simple here about how this works. F1, if you were to push this block that way, let's call that F1. But now, right here, where the actual block makes contact with the surface, there is a frictional force. Ooh, remember that. There's a frictional force that moves in the opposite direction. Let's call that F2, this being F1. Now, if F1, hang in there with me, I'm going somewhere with this, okay? This will all make sense in just a bit. If F1 is greater than F2, the block will move. But if F2 is strong, in other words, pulling that way, it won't move. For example, if this was sand has high frictional force. In other words, if you ever try to push a block, try to imagine, visualize if you will, pushing a block over sand. It has a high frictional force, which means it's not going to move that easily. But if instead of sand we have a tile floor, then all of a sudden the frictional force here goes down and you can push easily. So again, if you had a constant force pushing, if this was sand, the frictional force would be too much for it to overcome. But then if we had a tile floor, smooth, same force here, it would probably overcome the frictional force too, and you'll be able to move it forward. Now, you're probably saying, well, Victor, what does all this have to do with selling and ousting a customer? I'm getting to that. Now, let's go to the next slide. Imagine, if you will, that instead of a block, we have a brain. More specifically, a customer brain, right? And our job is to persuade, using this persuasion force, to move a customer to make a buying decision. But there's also this frictional force that they don't want to make that decision. In other words, up here, we're talking about the gain. Let me go back to my marker here. Up here, we talk about the gain, right? We try to persuade them there's a gain. This is why you should buy. Feature, benefit, advantage, gain. But there's a frictional force moving the other way that's called risk. So you see the problem now from a physics standpoint. We can apply pressure, but there's only much pressure you can apply to a customer. If there's too much frictional force, risk, or perceived risk, they're not going to make a buying decision. So keep this in mind. You can only push a customer brain so much. So if we can't really pressure customers into buying, which in today's market is very hard to do, you don't really want to do this, then if we can't change the force we apply here, then what we can do is reduce this force. In other words, reduce the frictional force. If we can reduce the frictional force, then we can gently move the brain into a buying decision. Now, there's three forces at play here. And again, I'll tie this all together into sales here. Now, here are the three frictional forces. The first one I want to talk about is gain, right? The first question customers have is, if I buy your product or service, is there a gain? Let's see. So customers are going to ask this question. For example, I love using this example. Let's say that you currently have this right here, right? This is your internet service provider, and basically you got 1 gig up and down, right? Asymmetrical, and you're paying $100 a month. Along comes Victor Antonio to sell you Victor's cable system, or internet service provider, right? And here's what I'm going to offer you. I'm going to offer you better than that, and I'm going to drop the price so it's better than that. In other words, I'm going to increase capacity or speed download and upload speed by 10%, and I'm going to drop the price by 10%. So is there a gain? Is there a gain? Well, there's an obvious gain. There's an obvious gain here. The question is, will a customer buy? Will that be enough to make the customer buy? What do you think? What do you think? Is that enough to make a customer buy? Would you take that deal? If this is your current service, current price, service price, and I came to your door, knock, knock, I would say, look, I'm going to give you 10% more speed, and I'm going to reduce the cost by 10%. Would you take the deal? Yes or no? Yes or no? Would you take the deal mentally? Guess what? The majority of people wouldn't take the deal. There's an obvious gain. So that's the first hurdle we have to overcome as far as frictional force. So there is a gain. In other words, we're talking to the customer and say, look, there's a gain. So let's go to the second frictional force. The second frictional force is magnitude, right? Magnitude. In other words, okay, there's a gain, check. But how big is that gain? And I just showed you that 10% gain in terms of speed and in terms of price is not enough. So then customers might be looking for a magnitude. Well, how big is that gain? Because, 10% is not going to cut it, Victor. All right, well, let's extend this example one step further. What if now this is the deal? I'm giving you 50% more capacity. In other words, processing, upload, and download speed. I'm dropping the price by 50%. Now that is a sizable magnitude. That is sizable. And then I would say that maybe a percentage of people would take this deal because that's sizable, right? It has magnitude. But I would argue to you that even customers getting this deal probably go, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'll take that deal, Victor. I don't know. Again, I believe a certain percentage will, but I still believe that a majority will not take the deal. Why? Third component of the frictional force. We've demonstrated gain. Yes, I can give you better speed and a better price. Not good enough. I now showed magnitude. All right, 50% more speed. I'm dropping the price by 50%. Come on. Have you ever presented to a customer that's so obvious they should make a buying decision, but they don't? Even when you show magnitude, like how much you can save them and how much better it could be, they'll still go, not sure. So what is it? Again, some people will buy this right here. Price hunters will definitely pick this up. But the majority of people simply won't buy. Why? Let's analyze this. There's a third frictional force. And this is the big one. By the way, this is where we lose deals. There is something called perceived effort. So now, by the way, I just want to be clear. There is a gain. Great. There is magnitude, but I still won't buy. Then there's this perceived effort. And that is how much effort is going to take me, Victor, to switch over from this cable system to that cable system. And if I perceive that effort to be high, it doesn't matter if the gain or the magnitude. If the perceived effort is high, that's the ultimate frictional force. People go, no, I'm not going to buy. Let me show you what I mean. Let's get into this visually. We're all familiar with the iceberg analogy, right? You can see 10% of the iceberg below the waterline is 90% of the iceberg. Now, here's why this is important, and this analogy, this visual analogy is important. The 10% up here is what you typically do. You go in there, you talk about the features that you offer with your product. You talk about the benefits the customer can get. And then, bam, you drop the advantage on them and you talk about, look, not only is there a gain, right? There's also magnitude, right? But the customer still doesn't buy. Most presentations focus on this up here. But now let's ask ourselves, put yourself in that position. I'm trying to sell you a cable system. I'm trying to sell you something. I just told you it's 50% off, 50% more speed, right? But why wouldn't you buy? Why wouldn't you buy? Because in your mind, you're thinking other things that have nothing to do with price, speed, velocity, capacity. You start thinking like below the line, things that most people probably won't say. I don't know, Victor. Seems like a hassle to me. Now, a customer probably won't verbalize that, but they'll go, seems like a hassle. And what about like fees? Like, if I cancel this other service, how does that work out, right? Or how about the equipment? Like, do I got to return the equipment? And by the way, I probably have to take a day off just to actually have this switched over. So all of a sudden, notice what's happening. The 10% is what you're presenting to. Here's why you should buy. Feature, benefit, advantage, right? There's the gain and the magnitude. But below the line, the unstated needs or the unstated concern the client has is, I don't know, seems like a hassle to me. I don't know if I want to do that. How about this one? I don't know, man. What about the fees? What's about the cancellation fee? Who's going to return the equipment? Do I have to take a day off? So these are some of the concerns. So here's where we lose deals. Here's why the customer won't switch over. You've done a great job at presenting above the waterline. You presented the customer's feature, benefit, advantage, gain, nailed it. Dunk, swish, all net, right? But there's these underlying concerns that you didn't address, which is what the customer's thinking. This is all perceived effort. This is pure resistance to not make a buying decision. I don't want to move forward. I'm going to pull back. So how do you solve this problem? Imagine for a moment that you take your presentation. By the way, it could be formal presentation, PowerPoint. It could be informal, you talking through it. If we know our products, we'll talk about the feature, benefit, advantage. Got that. Check. But if we also know that there are underlying concerns below the waterline, then we should raise those concerns. Now, let's get into it. Some of you are familiar with my course, Blocking Objections. If you're not, check out the Sales Velocity Academy. Check out the course, Blocking Objections. Of all the courses in the Sales Velocity Academy, without a doubt, no question, the Blocking Objections course is the most powerful of all. This will increase your conversion rate. And in there I actually walk through the psychology of what happens when you raise the objection, not the client. When you raise the objection, not the client, you're in control of the conversation. If the client raises the objection, the probability of closing that deal will go down. So here's what you're going to do. Look at your presentation. You got the feature, benefit, advantage, gain, right? But now what we want to do is block the underlying objections. Let me give you the examples. Here's the blocking objection structure I use. And again, if you're in the Sales Velocity Academy, download the book and the video because the book really walks you through the psychology of why this works. So let's go through it. We know that one of the concerns is, it's a hassle, Victor. I don't want to switch. In their mind, they're imagining all these things they have to do. It's a hassle. So what we have to do is raise that objection. Don't wait for the customer to do it, because if they do it, then you find yourself in a very defensive position. So be proactive. As they say, lean in the direction of the objection. Let me pause on that. Lean in the direction of the objection. In other words, take the objection head on. So in this case, I know that it's there. They're thinking it's a hassle. So here's how you block an objection. First of all, you raise the objection. You say something like this. Look, many of our customers worry that switching over would be a hassle. And then you say, you offer to resolve it. Let me walk you through the simple process of switching over and how we do it. Now, slow this movie down. Because I know this objection's in their head, because I raised it, first of all, credibility builder, trust builder right away. They're thinking, well, I'm glad he brought it up because I was afraid to say it. And then you're going to offer to resolve. Now, this part I can't help you with because you'll have to show and tell them. I call this the demo piece. You have to show them. So, for example, I would say, look, here's how we do it. Phase 1, step 2, step 3, and you're switched over, right? And then once you do that, once you do the demo piece, and again, you say something like this, can you now see how simple, in other words, hassle-free the process is? And as soon as they say yes, you've just tied down that objection. That's what's powerful. So now, in that presentation, I raise the issue of hassle. And so again, I put it to bed. Again, I raise it, I offer to resolve it, I do some show and tell, something that'll show how the transition will work. And then you ask this key question. Can you now see how with our phase plan, this is really not going to be a hassle? And they're going to go, yes. And that basically ties down this objection. But what about the other objections? Somewhere in your conversation, you're going to bring up the next objection. How about this one? You know, Victor, we're happy with our current supplier. That's a big one, right? So again, do you wait for the customer to say, I'm happy with my current supplier? No, because if you do that, literally they declared that objection, which makes it harder for you to overcome it. See, that's the problem. Most people are taught about overcoming objections, not blocking, which is why they struggle in closing more deals. I know in the customer's head, they're happy with their current supplier, or at least satisfied at a minimum. So if I know that, I'm going to raise the objection. Again, control the conversation. I'll say something like this. Many of our clients were initially happy with their current service provider until we showed them two things they haven't considered. Now I offer, do you mind if I show you how both speed and I'll say safety impact change can impact your cable? Then you offer, do the show and tell. And then last but not least, you tie down the objection by saying, can you now see how our technology and advantage can help you basically be as good, if not better, than your current service provider? What have I just done? I've highlighted two objections already. I know that they have in their head. And what you're doing is, as you're raising these objections, you're reducing that perceived effort/risk. Go back to the block. As I'm raising these objections and knocking them down, the objections are in their head. I'm reducing that resistance. I'm reducing that friction that will allow you to move the deal forward. One more. Let's do one more. Because then this is an easy one, right? Well, what about the fees and the equipment, Victor? Again, we know that's in their head. So what we want to do is say something like this. Now, two questions that always come up are, what about cancellation fees and equipment returns? How does that work? Now, again, you raise the objection, like, thank God he raised the objection. Then you say something, you offer to resolve. Well, here's what we do so you don't have to worry about either. And then you'll talk about, again, the show and tell pieces where you'll talk about how you're going to basically take the equipment, you're going to go return it. Your company will guarantee that they'll absorb any cancellation fees associated with their existing contract. And then you say something like this. Did we make that easy enough for you by telling you that we're going to handle fees and everything else? They go, yeah, you're making that very easy. Now notice what's happening. Again, I'm raising objections that are below the waterline in the iceberg analogy. And by reducing that, by every time I raise an objection, I know they have in their head, and then I solve it, I'm reducing that resistance. I'm reducing that friction, and it allows me to move the deal further. So the big takeaways here is that you can talk about gain. Okay, you're going to get a gain. In other words, we do it a little better. They go, okay, great. You can also talk about magnitude. No, we do it better. And here's the magnitude of how we do it better. How much more, how much better we are than your current service provider. But at the end of the day, if you can't reduce that perceived effort, then that's always going to be tough. So again, show them the gain, show them the magnitude, but right here is where the money's made. This is where the deal's either lost or won. If you can reduce that perceived effort, you'll see them move forward on making a deal. Now, in the next section for next week, I'm going to talk about the second part, which is how do you position yourself as a trusted advisor during the conversations? So we're doing two things here. One is we're trying to reduce resistance, right? In other words, the friction from moving forward. But at the same time, what we have to do is position ourselves as a trusted advisor so they'll trust us to make that buying decision. And we'll talk about that in the next section. Now that